Good morning, everyone. This is Michael Snyder. I am a general permit writer with the state of Idaho in the IPDES program, and I developed the 2022 construction general permit. That permit will be effective in about a week on February 10th, 2022. And today I'm just gonna run through some of the, the summary of the requirements and go over some of the big changes that are notable. Please do note that we have the permit and the fact sheet available on our website. So you can refer to it there for the entirety of the permit and its requirements. Today we're gonna do a summary, but the permit itself has the actual requirements. So yeah, the agenda, I will first run through the permit requirements, and then I'm going to highlight some of the major changes. At that point, I plan on having a short break, and then we will do a Q&A session. Like I mentioned, the permit can be found on our website, and there's a link in this here. And then if you find you have questions during the permit term, you can refer to your local DEQ regional office and reach out to the IPDES compliance officer there, and they should be able to help you out. All right, so we're going to get into the permit requirements first. Basically, I broke this down into kind of the 8 main sections of the permit. We will run through section 1, which is how to get coverage and who's eligible. Section 2, which is the technology-based effluent limits. Section 3, water quality-based effluent limits. Section 4 is the site inspection requirements. Section 5, I know we got a fair number of public comments about corrective actions. We're going to kind of discuss that a little bit more. Then we'll get into the stormwater team and training, the SWIP plan, and then finally the termination of permit coverage. All right, in coverage. So section 1 of the permit goes through who is eligible, how to obtain coverage, what that coverage entails, what is an allowed discharge and what is not. So that first, section on eligibility, basically the permit covers construction projects that are 1 acre or more, or are part of a larger common plan of development that is 1 acre or more, that discharge to a water of the U.S. The permit covers 2 different types of dischargers. There are 2 types of operators that are covered. There's the person who has, or the entity that has day-to-day operational control over the site. So that's, your typical general contractor, the people actually out on site doing the work. And it covers the other one is the person with control over the plans and specifications and the ability to make changes to those. So that is often the owner of the project, though that could be delegated to an engineer, for instance. But basically those 2 entities are required, are eligible for coverage, and if there is a discharge are required to get coverage. It does not require like subcontractors to obtain coverage though. So it's only, the main contractor and the owner generally that would be eligible. It authorizes certain discharges, and those discharges are described in section 1.2. That includes stormwater discharges, should kind of go without saying considering the name of the permit. But then it also authorizes some non-stormwater discharges, which can generally be summarized as, potable water type discharges that are not contaminated and will meet water quality standards. Section 1.3 goes into some of the prohibited discharges, and that's things like construction or concrete waste, water, any sort of oils and greases, or just anything, any pollutant that would not meet water quality standards. If that is in your discharge, then that would be prohibited. In section 1.4, we discuss submitting your notice of intent. The biggest change in this section actually has been implemented since July 1st, 2021. In the prior EPA permit, you were asked to submit your notice of intent through EPA's NET system. Since July 1st, 2021, DEQ has taken primacy for this, and notices of intent have been submitted through the IPDES e-permitting system. And I've included a brief screenshot of kind of what that application looks like. So you will still be submitting notice of intent through the e-permitting system. There's a 14-day waiting period after submittal before DEQ can authorize coverage. And that's to allow some other agencies time to request additional information if necessary. In general, most projects need to submit at least 14 days ahead of time. The exception generally being for emergency projects, which are allowed to submit a notice of intent up to 30 days after they begin work. Obviously, we're not trying to interfere with emergency work. And then the other kind of key exception to that is projects that are currently ongoing that have coverage of the 2017 permit are seeking to continue coverage under the 2022 permit. Will have 60 days after the effective date. So starting February 10th, they will have 60 days to submit their notice of intent to continue coverage under the 2022 permit. So that resubmittal is required by April 11th, 2022. And if you fail to resubmit your notice of intent for coverage by April 11th, 2022, then your project's current coverage will be terminated. Section 1.5 also requires that you post notice of coverage in a spot that is visible from the entrance of the site. That requirement has not changed. Section 2 is on technology-based effluent limits. And this is, I think, kind of the key component that most people are familiar with when they go to a construction site. These technology-based effluent limits are the best management practices that you can see on the site that are helping to reduce pollutant discharge. Technology-based effluent limits are based on EPA's effluent limit development guidelines. The requirements haven't changed in a while, so the EPA permit that everyone is currently covered under, the 2017 permit, has very, very similar requirements as what is in this 2022 permit. They're based on the same document. So 2.1 is on stormwater control, design, installation, and maintenance. And basically that is requiring that you put in controls that will direct the flow of water such that it does not erode your site. So it's making sure that you have an engineer who's designing and making sure that you have stormwater infrastructure in place and that you're maintaining it appropriately. Section 2 is more of the temporary controls, the erosion and sediment control, which is, as you can see with the picture on the right, a silt fence is a form of perimeter sediment control. So this section is where all of the requirements to minimize disturbed areas, limit dust generation, have a stabilized entrance, all of those requirements that that people are generally familiar with seeing on construction sites are contained in this section. Generally, they're the same, BMPs we've seen for a decade now in the various construction permits prior. Section 2.3 is on pollution prevention. So that goes into the requirements related to material storage, waste storage, making sure that there's spill and leak prevention, that spills are cleaned up quickly and disposed of properly, and that there isn't unnecessary pollutants being exposed to stormwater and allowed to discharge. And then section 4 on construction dewatering is basically some of the minimum requirements to make sure that if you do need to dewater part of your site, that discharge will meet water quality standards. So this section is the best management practices. There are no numeric limits associated with this section. Here are things that you can do or that you're required to do that will help to minimize discharge of pollutants in stormwater. Section 3 is on water quality-based effluent limits. And this is where we get into some of the more numeric limits associated with the permit. There is a generic statement regarding that all sites have to meet applicable water quality standards. That covers the fact that we can't predict what all pollutants may be present at each individual site, but you are still required, if you have a pollutant present and you believe it may discharge, you're still required to meet the water quality standards should that pollutant discharge. Some of the big changes are in sections 3.3 and 3.4, where we go through the conditions for sites that are discharging from construction dewatering and from storm events. The 2017 permit did have storm event monitoring in the Idaho specific section. We've sewn that into the main body of the permit here and kind of clarified some of the sections. The key takeaways for that turbidity monitoring, because it is just turbidity monitoring for both of these sections. You are required to monitor if your site is discharging for either of these reasons. And it is a discharge that does not have any intervening conveyance systems between you and the water of the US that is the receiving water. The reason that you can't have an intervening, say, MS4 system, you need to have the ability to sample immediately upstream and immediately at your discharge point. And it's unrealistic to expect anyone that is not, adjacent to their receiving water to be able to determine where they're receiving, where their exact discharge point is, and to measure their discharge relative to the background, considering that it may have commingled with other discharges in that conveyance system. So these two sections are only for those sites that are actually adjacent to, that their discharge does not have any intervening conveyance systems between their discharge and the receiving water. Both sections require that you monitor upstream of your discharge and at the discharge within any plume that's visible. And you are monitoring for turbidity to make sure that your discharge is within 50 NTU of the upstream receiving water discharge, the background receiving water discharge. Construction dewatering, you're required to monitor every day that that's occurring. Storm event monitoring, it's required if during discharges from storm events, but only during normal operating hours. We are not requiring you to go out on the weekends or at night to conduct the sampling. It's just if it's raining, if there's a discharge during normal operating hours, that is when you'd be required to conduct that monitoring. Section 4 is on inspections. So inspections are, we had proposed a change to make that consistent, where everyone would be conducting inspections at the same time. We had some feedback and decided to go back to EPA's prior version. So inspections will continue to be required either once every 7 days or every 14 days plus during storm events. And each site has the option to pick whichever fits better for their site. When an inspection is conducted, you're basically going out and observing the site, and you are looking at the best management practices, making sure that any maintenance is being conducted as appropriate, that the BMPs are working as intended, you know, that there's the phase of construction matches the BMPs that are in place, that sort of thing. There is increased inspection frequency for sites that are discharging dewatering water. You are already out there having to do monitoring, so you'll also be conducting an inspection to make sure that the BMPs are working during that dewatering. There are reductions in inspection frequency. Is generally one of two conditions. One is work has stopped due to frozen conditions, at which point you can reduce from your previously chosen once a week or every 2 weeks plus storm event, and you can reduce that to once a month. The alternative reduction is if you are in a drought or arid area, you are also allowed to reduce inspection frequency to once a month. When you are conducting an inspection, section 4.5 walks through all the different parts of the site that need to be inspected. It really boils down to you know, looking over the entirety of the site, looking at your discharge locations to see if there's evidence of erosion, looking at the BMPs that are in place, you know, looking for spills or leaks, and making sure that those are being cleaned up appropriately, that sort of thing. And then each week or every 2 weeks, depending, you will document your inspection findings in an inspection report, and that describes all the places that you observed. If any routine maintenance was required, you know, you want to document that maintenance is occurring. You want to document who conducted the inspection, you know, when and where it was, that sort of thing. This largely has not changed. You know, the requirements are basically the same as you've seen in the 2017 permit. Section 5 is on corrective action. And I would like to note we did receive a number of comments during the public comment period regarding this section. We've tried to make it more clear that corrective action is required when there is a condition that is non-compliant with the permit, and the corrective action is returning you to compliance with the permit. So that is not routine maintenance. You know, if you're taking sediment out from behind a silt fence, that's just normal part of construction. That is something that you'll do periodically throughout the life of the project. Corrective actions are more for when there is a significant failure of your BMPs such that you are not complying with the terms of the permit. So this could be something like if you have a sediment basin on site and the walls of the sediment basin fail, and you have a significant discharge of sediment into the receiving water. This is significant failures, not routine maintenance. When there is a condition that requires corrective action on site, it is required that you begin the corrective action within 24 hours, or within the next business day, sorry, and that it be completed within 7 business days. If it's going to take longer than that, then you are allowed to document that it will take longer than that, and explain why, and then put in that how long it's anticipated to take until you earn to permanent compliance. Corrective action can also be required should the EQ conduct an inspection of your site. We are allowed to require corrective action be conducted if we see an issue. And then this corrective action log is maintained of when corrective action was required, what it was, how long it took to complete. That sort of information is required to be documented in a corrective action log, which you keep in your stormwater pollution prevention plan. Section 6 goes through who is the stormwater team on site. And basically, the stormwater team is anyone who has a distinct responsibility related to permit compliance. So this will include the people that are on site installing best management practices, the person who is conducting inspections, the person who is modifying the SWIP, or who submitted the notice of intent and got coverage that way. So all of these people should be mentioned in the stormwater team. There are training requirements for these people that basically requires that they be knowledgeable about the stormwater best management practices. They should know how to identify if they're working, what maintenance is anticipated for them, and generally, where best management practices should be implemented. We did add a reference to EPA's upcoming training. The EPA is intending to offer a training beginning, we believe that's summer 2022. EPA's training will meet the training requirements. We gave it a specific call out. However, there are numerous other trainings that meet the training requirements listed in the permit. And then the stormwater team needs to have access to the permit documents. They need to be able to access the stormwater pollution prevention plan. They need to have access to the corrective action log, to the inspection reports. All of that documentation needs to be available to the stormwater team. Section 7 is on the stormwater pollution prevention plan. This document is essentially the who, what, when, where, how, and why of permit compliance for a project. DEQ does not have a template, but EPA does, and I've shared the cover here of what their SWIP template looks like. EPA's template should meet the requirements of our permit as well. Generally, the SWIP is on site. It is kept up to date as the project advances, as the phases of construction come and go. Different BMPs are appropriate, different pollutants are on site, and the SWIP is a catalog of all of the ongoing changes on site. The SWIP should have the inspection reports that were mentioned earlier, the corrective action log, the list of the stormwater team and their training. It needs to have site maps that detail where work is going on, what BMPs are in place. It has a list of the pollutants that are anticipated to be on site. basically this is the living document that describes how the site is maintaining permit compliance as work continues. And as such, it should be modified frequently. Anytime the site is transitioning, the project is transitioning to something new, that transition, that the moving of BMPs, the new operators that are on site, all of that needs to be documented in the stormwater pollution prevention plan. And finally, in section 8, we have terminating coverage. The minimum information to file a notice of termination is basically who is filing for termination, which entity it is, what permit number they have associated with their project, and which condition that they meet in order to terminate coverage. Typically, the condition that is met for terminating coverage is that all work on site is complete, all the equipment is off site, all of the wastes are off site, there is no more temporary BMPs on site, everything has been removed. And then for any disturbed areas, they need to be at 70% of the pre-construction vegetated area. So if prior to construction, roughly 50% of the site was vegetated, post-construction, you are not eligible for termination until 35%, which is 70% of that 50 is vegetated again. Alternatively, you can terminate if you have transferred all responsibility to other entities that have permit coverage. So in that case, it would look like, maybe an owner or a contractor came in and they did the streets and utilities, and then they have sold the lots to build houses to a home builder. That home builder has obtained coverage, at which point the original contractor is eligible for to terminate coverage because the other entity now has coverage for the entire area. The notice of termination is submitted through the e-permitting system, similar to the notice of intent. Notices of termination are required to be submitted within 30 days of meeting the conditions for termination, and they are effective at midnight of the day that the termination was submitted. And again, I'd like to note that on April 11th, 2022, any notices of intent that are currently covered, which have not resubmitted to continue coverage under the 2022 permit, will be terminated. So please, if you have an existing coverage, starting February 10th, you will have 60 days to resubmit to continue that coverage under the new permit. And now I'm going to highlight some of the significant changes and direct you to where the response to comments is located if you have a specific comment you were looking for. So some of the significant changes, just really briefly, were in the coverage area, how to submit your NOIs, in turbine monitoring, in the training requirements, and in the other agency reviews. So in the coverage area, this should be rather apparent, but previously we were working under EPA's 2016 permit, which covered the entirety of the United States. Idaho DEQ has issued a permit that covers the state of Idaho outside of tribal reservation boundaries, because that is where we have authority to authorize discharges. Yeah, pretty straightforward on that one, I feel. The NOI submittal has had a fairly significant change. that has actually already been implemented since July 1st, 2021. You are no longer using EPA's NET tool, and you are now using TEQ's e-permitting system to submit your notices of intent, as well as your notices of termination. We will offer additional training on how to use that system on February 10th, 11th, and 15th. So if you have questions regarding the e-permitting system, please attend one of those trainings, and we should be able to help you out on that. Turbidity monitoring, like I mentioned before, there was storm event monitoring required in the 2017 permit. I would like to note that the 2017 permit, if you exceeded the turbidity limits, it required you to meet them for 10 consecutive days before you could resume work. So basically, if you exceeded it, you had to stop work, take action to address the cause of the exceedance, and you had to meet water quality standards for 10 days before work could resume. Under the 2022 permit, you still have to stop work if you exceed. However, work can resume if the discharge ceases. So if the storm event discharge does exceed the water quality standards, you can resume work when that discharge is done, or after you have gotten that discharge to meet water quality standards. It's an important nuance that we wanted to highlight to, help out the industry. The other change is that we added the monitoring for construction dewatering, and that we clarified that both monitoring is only required when there is a discharge from the site to WOTUS, to Waters of the U.S. with no intervening conveyance system or other intermediaries. And again, that requirement is in there because we need you to take upstream sampling information. We need you to conduct upstream sampling to determine what the background turbidity is in order to compare to check if you're meeting the water quality standards. So if there's no way for you to determine the background, then we're not requiring that the sampling occur. And turbidity sampling is required, like I said, both immediately upstream and then within the discharge, right at, if there is a visible plume within that plume, to do a comparison to check against the water quality standards. Another big change was in the training requirements. You'll note that the general requirement of having a certification or license that covers, the principles and practices of erosion and sediment control, and the installation and maintenance of erosion and sediment control, and performing inspections. That requirement was in the 2017 permit and is also in the 2022 permit. We just called out specifically that EPA's inspection course will meet those requirements. There are other training options available, and we anticipate that EPA's one will become available in summer 2022. But you don't have to take EPA's if you prefer a different training, so long as it meets those minimum requirements. Another big change is under the 2017 construction permit, there was an appendix for historic property screening, and that was required before you could submit your notice of intent. In the 2022 permit, we have removed the historic office review, so that screening process is no longer included and no longer required prior to submitting your notices of intent. the response to comments, so we received comments from 17 entities, 201 individual comments, and those comments and responses can be found in Appendix A of the fact sheet. So if you submitted a comment and you want to see specifically what we had to say or what changes we made based on, please do refer to Appendix A of the fact sheet for that information. Thank you. That is what I had for the general requirements and